Imagine waking before sunrise, knowing that a single storm could flood your camp, ruin the hunt, and leave your entire group cold and hungry. There were no weather apps, satellites, forecasts, or scientific instruments, yet ancient humans still had to decide whether it was safe to travel. A clear morning could become dangerous within hours, and choosing the wrong path might trap hunters far from shelter when heavy rain arrived. For most of human history, predicting weather was not a matter of convenience because it could determine who found food and who returned alive. Before leaving camp, ancient hunters studied the horizon, felt the wind on their skin, and listened carefully to the sounds around them. They noticed small changes that modern people often ignore, including unusual clouds, colder air, restless animals, and the smell of wet soil. None of these signs explained exactly why the weather was changing, but they often warned that something important was approaching. Ancient humans did not need to understand atmospheric pressure because they only needed to recognize what usually happened after certain signs appeared. If dark clouds formed above distant hills, the group might shorten the hunt and remain close to caves, trees, or rocky shelter. If the wind suddenly changed direction, experienced members could warn everyone that rain, cold air, or a violent storm might soon follow. One observation alone was rarely enough, so they compared the sky, the wind, the animals, and the behavior of smoke from the fire. When several warning signs appeared together, the group could delay a journey, protect stored food, and strengthen temporary shelters before conditions became dangerous. This knowledge was built slowly through repeated experience, because every season gave people another chance to notice patterns and remember the results. A child might watch an elder point toward a strange cloud, then see rain arrive later that day, and remember the connection forever. Over time, these memories became shared knowledge passed through stories, warnings, gestures, and conversations around the evening fire. The most valuable weather predictors were probably not the strongest hunters, but the people who paid attention and remembered what others had forgotten. They knew which winds brought cold air, which clouds usually produced rain, and which animal behaviors appeared before storms. Their predictions were not always correct, because nature could still change suddenly and produce conditions nobody expected. However, they did not need perfect accuracy because even a small warning could provide enough time to move camp or find protection. The difference between noticing a storm early and noticing it too late could mean dry firewood, preserved food, and children sleeping safely through the night. Without written records, every successful prediction strengthened the group's trust in the person who recognized the signs. Every failed prediction also became a lesson, helping people separate reliable patterns from coincidences that only appeared meaningful. Generation after generation, ancient humans created a practical weather system using memory, observation, and the natural world surrounding them. They were not predicting the future through magic, because they were reading clues that had appeared many times before. The sky was their warning screen, the wind was their messenger, and the behavior of animals offered information long before the first raindrops fell. To understand how this worked, you must first look upward, because some of the clearest warnings were written across the ancient sky. Ancient humans began with clouds because their shape, height, color, and movement often revealed how the air was changing above them. Thin clouds spreading across a clear sky could suggest that wetter weather was approaching, especially when they slowly thickened over several hours. Low dark clouds moving quickly across the horizon were more urgent, warning that heavy rain or strong wind might arrive very soon. Experienced observers did not simply notice whether clouds existed because they remembered which cloud patterns usually appeared before specific kinds of weather. A tall cloud growing upward during a warm afternoon could signal unstable air, while a flat gray sky often meant longer periods of steady rain. The speed of the clouds also mattered, because fast movement high above could reveal strong winds before those winds reached the ground. Ancient humans compared cloud direction with the wind they felt below, noticing when the upper sky moved differently from the air around camp. When clouds began gathering from a familiar direction, people could prepare based on what had happened during previous storms from that same horizon. The color of the sky provided another clue, especially during sunrise and sunset when light passed through dust, moisture, and distant clouds. A red sky in the evening could sometimes suggest dry weather approaching, while a red morning might warn that unsettled weather was moving closer. These signs were not universal, because coastlines, mountains, deserts, and forests each created their own local patterns. Ancient communities learned the meaning of their own sky, rather than following a single rule that worked everywhere. The moon also became an important source of information, especially when a pale ring appeared around it during the night. That glowing circle could form when ice crystals filled high clouds, sometimes appearing before a larger weather system arrived. People did not know what ice crystals were, but they could remember that a ring around the moon was often followed by rain. The stars offered clues as well, because unusually hazy skies could suggest moisture or dust gathering in the atmosphere. When familiar stars appeared dimmer than usual, experienced travelers might expect the weather to change before the next night. The horizon was watched carefully at dawn, when distant cloud banks, mist, and shifting colors were easiest to notice. A dark line beneath bright clouds could indicate rain falling far away, even before anyone at camp felt a single drop. Lightning flashing silently on the horizon also warned that a storm was active beyond the hills and might eventually move closer. Ancient humans learned to estimate direction by watching where clouds grew, where lightning appeared, and how quickly the dark sky expanded. They also noticed how mountains changed the weather, because clouds often gathered around peaks before rain reached the lower valleys. In open grasslands, the horizon gave earlier warnings, while forests forced people to rely more heavily on sound, wind, and small openings in the canopy. Every landscape taught a different lesson, and people survived by learning the patterns of the exact place where they lived. Children watched adults point toward clouds, the moon, or the horizon, slowly learning which changes deserved attention and which could be ignored. Over many years, the sky became a living record of patterns, offering warnings to anyone patient enough to study it. Yet the sky was only one source of information, because some of the most useful warnings could be felt directly on the skin. The first sign of changing weather might be a cooler breeze touching the skin before any cloud became visible above the camp. Ancient humans paid close attention to sudden changes in wind direction because familiar winds often carried predictable temperatures, moisture, and storms. A warm breeze might suggest stable conditions, while a sharp cold gust could warn that a powerful weather front was approaching. They could not measure wind speed, but they watched grass, leaves, smoke, dust, and tree branches to understand how strongly the air was moving. Smoke rising straight from a fire usually suggested calm air, while smoke bending low across the ground could signal increasing wind or moisture. When smoke refused to rise and remained trapped near the camp, people might expect damp weather or rain to arrive soon. The smell of the air also changed before rainfall, especially when moisture released strong scents from soil, plants, rocks, and decaying leaves. Ancient humans may not have known why the earth smelled different, but they learned that this scent often appeared before the first drops. In dry regions, the smell of distant rain could travel across open land, warning people that water was falling beyond the visible horizon. Humidity could also be felt on the body, making skin sticky, hair heavier, and animal hides softer than they had been earlier. Wood, fibers, and leather absorbed moisture from the air, giving ancient people additional clues that wetter conditions were developing. A bowstring might loosen, dry grass might bend differently, and stored materials could become damp before rain reached the shelter. Sound sometimes traveled farther through cool, moist air, making distant animals, rivers, or voices seem unusually clear. When familiar sounds suddenly appeared louder or closer, experienced listeners could recognize that the atmosphere was changing around them. The air before a storm could also feel unusually still, as birds became quieter and leaves stopped moving for several moments. This silence did not guarantee danger, but when it appeared with dark clouds and rising humidity, it became a warning worth respecting. Ancient humans also noticed sudden temperature drops, especially during warm days, when cold air rushed ahead of approaching rain. A hunter feeling that change might turn back immediately, knowing that the storm itself could arrive faster than expected. In mountainous regions, cold air flowed down slopes at predictable times, while unusual winds could indicate a larger change beyond the valley. Coastal communities learned the daily rhythm of sea breezes and became alert when those familiar patterns arrived late or disappeared completely. People living near deserts watched dust rising in the distance, because a moving wall of sand could reveal powerful winds before they reached camp. They did not depend on one sensation alone, since a cold breeze might come without rain and damp air might remain harmless. Instead, they combined what they felt with what they saw, heard, and smelled, building a fuller picture of the approaching weather. An elder might notice low smoke, a colder wind, and the scent of wet soil, then order everyone to protect the firewood. That decision could happen long before thunder began, giving the group enough time to cover food and move children toward shelter. Their bodies became simple weather instruments, constantly receiving information from the air without numbers, charts, or written forecasts. But the atmosphere was not the only thing reacting to change, because animals and plants often responded before humans understood what was happening. Animals often reacted to changing air pressure, humidity, wind, and temperature before ancient humans could see any obvious sign in the sky. Birds flying lower than usual sometimes suggested that insects had moved closer to the ground as moist air gathered before rain. When large groups of birds suddenly returned to trees or cliffs, hunters understood that worsening weather might be approaching. Insects also provided useful warnings, because mosquitoes, flies, and other small creatures often became more active when humidity increased. Frogs called more loudly near ponds and marshes during damp conditions, helping nearby communities recognize that rain could soon follow. Ants sometimes closed the openings of their nests, carried food underground, or moved their eggs before heavy rainfall reached the area. Ancient humans did not assume that animals could predict the future, but they noticed that animal behavior changed when the environment changed. Herd animals might become restless, gather more tightly, or move toward protected ground before strong wind or cold rain arrived. Hunters who followed these animals learned that unusual movement could reveal danger beyond the hills or outside their field of view. Predators offered clues as well, because wolves, large cats, and other hunters often changed their routines when storms affected their prey. A quiet forest could be more meaningful than a noisy one, especially when birds, insects, and small mammals became silent at the same time. If this silence appeared beside dark clouds and falling temperature, the group had several warnings pointing toward the same conclusion. Domesticated animals in later communities became even more useful, since people observed their behavior every day and recognized small changes quickly. Dogs might seek shelter, remain close to the fire, or become unusually anxious as thunder and strong winds approached. Plants also reacted to moisture, temperature, and light, giving ancient people slower but dependable signs of seasonal weather changes. Some flowers closed before rainfall, while certain leaves folded, drooped, or turned their undersides toward the wind. Pine cones and dry seed structures changed shape as humidity increased, even though ancient observers could not explain the physical process. Moss, bark, and grasses held moisture differently before wet weather, allowing experienced gatherers to feel changes with their hands. The timing of flowering, fruiting, and falling leaves helped communities predict longer seasonal shifts rather than individual storms. When specific plants appeared, people knew that warmer days, seasonal rain, or colder nights would probably follow soon. Migrating birds and moving herds also acted like living calendars, marking changes that returned during similar periods each year. Ancient humans connected these movements with water levels, plant growth, hunting conditions, and the arrival of difficult weather. No single animal or plant sign was perfectly reliable, because hunger, predators, disease, and human activity could produce similar behavior. That is why skilled observers waited for several clues to agree before changing the group's plans. Low-flying birds, closed flowers, restless animals, and thickening clouds together created a much stronger warning than any clue alone. Over generations, people learned which signs were trustworthy in their region, and which were only coincidences remembered after the event. But noticing patterns was only the beginning, because survival depended on preserving those lessons and passing them accurately to others. Observing weather signs was useful, but ancient humans also needed a way to remember which signs had proven reliable across many different seasons. The oldest members of a group often carried decades of experience, including memories of storms, droughts, floods, and unusually cold years. They remembered which winds usually brought rain, when rivers began rising, and which birds appeared before seasonal changes. This knowledge did not exist as written data, but it survived through repeated stories, warnings, demonstrations, and shared daily routines. Around the fire, elders could describe a dangerous storm that arrived after strange clouds formed above a familiar mountain. Children listening to that story learned both the warning sign and the correct response, without needing to experience the disaster themselves. Stories made information easier to remember by connecting natural patterns with dramatic events, animals, ancestors, or important journeys. A simple rule about wind might disappear from memory, but a story about hunters trapped by that wind could remain for generations. Songs, repeated phrases, and seasonal rituals also helped communities preserve knowledge when there were no books or permanent records. Some traditions may have sounded magical, yet many were built around practical observations hidden beneath symbolic language. A warning about an angry sky spirit might encourage people to avoid open ground when thunderclouds gathered overhead. A ritual performed before the rainy season could also remind everyone to repair shelters, protect firewood, and move food away from flooding areas. Ancient humans did not separate survival knowledge, memory, religion, and storytelling as clearly as modern societies often do. All of these systems worked together, helping important lessons survive even when the original reason was no longer fully understood. People also used the sun, moon, and stars to track longer cycles connected with seasonal weather. The changing position of sunrise helped them recognize when warmer or colder periods were approaching. Repeated phases of the moon provided a simple way to count nights and compare the timing of rain, tides, animal movement, or plant growth. Certain stars appearing at dawn or disappearing from the evening sky could mark the return of familiar seasonal conditions. These observations did not produce a perfect calendar, but they helped people prepare for changes that happened at roughly the same time each year. A group might move toward higher ground before a wet season, or travel closer to water before the driest months began. They could gather extra fuel before colder weather, preserve more food, and repair clothing long before the first freezing night. Weather knowledge was especially valuable when different communities met, because travelers brought information from coastlines, valleys, forests, and distant plains. A visitor might explain that storms had already begun beyond the mountains, giving another group time to prepare for their arrival. Through trade, migration, and marriage, useful observations spread between people who lived in different environments. Still, experienced groups understood that old rules could fail when conditions changed, so they continued watching the world instead of trusting memory blindly. Every successful forecast strengthened a pattern, while every mistake forced people to compare what they expected with what actually happened. In this way, ancient weather knowledge was constantly tested, corrected, and improved through real consequences rather than formal experiments. Their forecasts were never as precise as modern science, but they were often accurate enough to protect food, shelter, travel plans, and human lives. The true power of their system came from combining long memory with constant attention to the present moment. And that raises a final question. What has modern technology given you, and what ancient ability may have quietly disappeared? Today, a phone can predict rain hours before it arrives, showing temperature, wind speed, and storm movement with remarkable accuracy. Satellites watch clouds from space, radar tracks rainfall, and computers compare enormous amounts of data in only a few seconds. Modern science can warn entire cities about hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and dangerous cold long before ancient communities could have reacted. Yet this accuracy has created a strange distance between people and the natural signals that once surrounded them every day. Many modern people check an app without looking at the sky, feeling the wind, or noticing how birds behave before a storm. The forecast may say rain is coming, but few people could explain what the clouds outside their window are already revealing. Ancient humans had less information, yet they often paid deeper attention to the small changes happening around them. They knew the ordinary rhythm of their environment so well that an unusual silence, breeze, or cloud immediately felt important. This ability did not come from special senses because it developed through patience, repetition, memory, and constant contact with nature. A person who spent every day outdoors naturally noticed patterns that someone living behind walls and screens might never recognize. Ancient humans were not always correct, and many traditional signs probably failed as often as they succeeded. Some observations became superstition, especially when people remembered successful predictions but forgot the many times nothing happened. However, the most reliable knowledge survived because mistakes carried serious consequences for food, travel, shelter, and safety. When a warning repeatedly protected the group, people remembered it, taught it, and included it in their seasonal routines. When a sign repeatedly failed, experienced observers eventually stopped trusting it or learned that it only worked under certain conditions. This slow process resembled an early form of testing, even though nobody recorded results in tables or explained them with scientific language. Ancient humans watched what happened, compared it with previous events, and changed their behavior when the pattern seemed dependable. Their knowledge was local, meaning a sign useful near the ocean might be useless in a desert or mountain valley. Modern forecasts describe huge regions, but ancient observers often understood the small area around their own camp with extraordinary detail. They knew where fog gathered first, which valley flooded fastest, and which hillside offered protection from the strongest wind. That local knowledge could turn a rough prediction into a practical decision about where to sleep, hunt, travel, or store food. The lesson is not that ancient methods were better than science, because modern forecasting is more precise, powerful, and life-saving. The lesson is that technology works best when it does not replace your awareness of the world directly around you. You can read a forecast and still watch the clouds, notice the wind, and recognize when conditions feel different from normal. Modern instruments explain why weather changes, while ancient observation reminds you to notice that the change has already begun. For ancient humans, predicting weather was never about controlling nature because it was about preparing before nature became dangerous. They could not see the future clearly, but they learned that the future often sent small warnings before it arrived. A cloud above the hills, a cold wind across the skin, or a silent forest could become a message worth taking seriously. Long before science explained the atmosphere, ancient humans survived by listening carefully to a world that was always speaking.